Hi everyone, thanks for joining me again. I'm having another play in my sketchbook today. This time I've applied a bit of gesso primer to the surface just to see how my inks and watercolours react to it. I'm still using the decorator's tape, but this time I've sealed the edges as well with a bit more gesso over the top, so hopefully nothing will seep underneath it. So the gesso is completely dry now, and I'm going to add some water to the surface, ready to drop some watercolour in. Starting off with a cerulean blue again, just to keep with the winter palette of colours still for now, and then adding in a bit of water to the edges to soften and fade them out. I'm also going to pull some of this blue over here just so it connects visually to the previous page. While that's wet, I'm going to add in some Payne's Grey just to darken it down a bit. Trying some ultramarine as well. It's good for granulation, so that might give us a nice little bit of texture. And a bit more Payne's Grey. The colours don't seem to be bleeding into each other as much as they usually do. I think that might be the gesso underneath. It's taking a bit more manipulation with the brush, so I'm going to try a bit of indigo ink instead. The surface is still wet, but I can already feel that this is much better. I think it's because the ink has a heavier pigment than the watercolour, so it's spreading a bit more easily, and I'm getting those dark tones that I want. Still adding in a bit of ultra though, just so that we can lighten the edges of the indigo as it comes down to the light. Using a bit of kitchen roll now just to dab away some of this excess paint, but that in itself is creating a nice texture, so I'm going to use some of that along the base here. I think this top bit could do with a bit more ultramarine, and I really like the marks that the kitchen roll left, so I'm going to do a bit more dabbing of that too. And then into that wetness I'm going to sprinkle a little bit of table salt. Just going to try to disperse this puddle a bit first though, just tilting the pages, because if you drop salt where there's too much fluid, the granules just get too full and we won't get the effect we want. So as I say, I'm going to gently sprinkle some salt in here. Don't be too heavy-handed with it though. We want that lovely speckled textured effect that the salt gives us. And if we have too many clumps of salt, we won't get it. You can see already here just how well that salt is starting to react. I'm going to pop a little bit more white acrylic at the bottom again here, using a palette knife, not only to connect to the previous page, but also gives us a base for the snowdrops to grow out from. And we can also use the edge of the knife just to scratch through some grasses for extra texture. So it's really just about making a dark background here, ready to put our snowdrops on top of. Starting to sketch the snowdrops in now. You can do this freehand if you want to, or there are plenty of templates online that you can download, or you can use a photo from a magazine to trace from. Remember, you can always use that trace down or the white carbon that we did in the first video, but just make sure that your surface is dry first. So just have fun, create a background that you're happy with, play with whatever materials you've got to hand. And remember, these are just ideas to get you started. By all means, try the salt and the dabbing with the tissue, but don't let that stop you. If you've got some ideas of your own, just go for it. Remember, sketchbooks are there for us to play and experiment in. Now that I've got an outline for my snowdrops, I'm using a small round head brush to apply some white acrylic. Be aware of where you want your light to come from. In this case, I'm wanting it from the top right. So that means the brighter parts of the petals will also be top right and the shadows will be on the opposite side. I'm going to use some indigo ink for the stems and putting in some shadows, but this time rather than use the dropper that comes in the bottle, I'm going to decant a little bit of it out onto a palette so that I can use my brush to apply it. Just like watercolour, if the ink goes onto a dry surface, you'll get a hard line, which is great for details. But if you want a softer feel and some shadow areas, either put it onto a wet area or soften the edges with a damp brush. What I'm doing now is lifting out some paint to create a few lighter leaf shapes. And because most of the background is watercolour, it should lift out quite easily. Just make sure you dab the paint off your brush onto a tissue so it keeps it clean. Whereas the first brush was a round head with a nice point that gave me a good leaf shape when I lifted out, This time I'm using a flathead brush with a nice edge. That'll give me some sharper lines for the grasses. I'm still making sure I wipe the excess paint off my brush though onto a tissue. So I'll continue to add some diluted indigo ink to the flowers now to build up their shape, and I'll also start to introduce some cerulean blue watercolour as well for some of the lighter tones. Coming back to the white acrylic now to reinforce the highlights, making them a bit stronger. And you can always help to soften any edge that you put on into the background colour a little bit more by just gently wiping it with your finger. So I'm just going to check my contrast now, maybe add a few more dark bits. Contrast is so important, making sure that our darks are dark enough and the lights are light enough. It's what makes objects look real. So often students say they feel their work looks a bit flat, and it's often because they haven't pushed the darks far enough. There's always this fear that if they put it in too dark, then they won't be able to get it out again if it's wrong. But without the darks, the lights won't be as effective, and vice versa. They need each other to work. Now that's all dry, I can dust off the salt and remove the tape. Remember to do it gently and fold it back on itself so that you're pulling away from the image. This way you can check if it's going to tear or not. If you do feel it sticking a bit, then just use a hairdryer and it'll help warm up the glue and it should come off cleanly. I'm adding a bit of text here now as a decorative feature around this edge. Personally, I love to see some writing in a sketchbook as well as images, whether that's my own notes, which are always really useful reminders as to what I've done, or just some words that I like, a quote maybe. Here I'm just adding a few words that suggest the meaning of snowdrops. Connecting this middle ground now between the two pages, putting some water on the surface first and then dropping in some cerulean blue watercolour. Then I'm going to add a few winter trees, keeping them quite light so they don't distract from the main parts. They're just going to help to create a visual bridge between the two. Adding in a little bit of that cobalt violet as well now, which will also act as a visual bridge by linking the colours. Moving over now to some white space for the second part of this little video and starting off again with some areas of water. Into that I'm going to add some cerulean again, wet in wet, so we'll end up with some nice soft edges. I'm not being too specific where I'm placing the colour, but I do have in mind that these tones will ultimately give us the subtle shadows in the flowers. So perhaps just bear in mind where you want them to be. You can see here that I'm starting to introduce a little bit of lime green, still watercolour, made with hooker's green and some lemon yellow. Watercolour dries lighter, so I'm just making some of these areas a little stronger, and then we can let it dry. Okay, so now to sketch in some larger snowdrops. Again, you can do this freehand if you want, or use a template like we did before. Remember to keep your lines light using a HB or a B pencil and don't press on too hard. And if you do make any mistakes, then a putty rubber is great for getting rid of them without leaving any smudgy marks behind. I'm using the hooker's green watercolour now to paint in the tops of the snowdrops and into the stems, but with this technique try to keep in mind that less is definitely more. I'm still aware that my light is coming from top right, so the shadows are going on the left, and while that green is still wet I'm adding a tiny bit of indigo ink into it, as well as in the stamens. Try to move around the page, doing a bit on each flower so they're all consistent. This also gives one time to dry off a little bit while you're working on another. I'm using water to drag the colour out here and into the body of the flower, and then dropping in a little bit of cerulean. You can see just how well that ink bleeds into the watercolour, creating depth, but also giving you a nice graduation of tone. Now, while all that is still wet, I'm putting some extra water just outside of the flower shape and then gently touching the edge to disturb it. This encourages the paint to bleed outside of the actual flower shape, giving a looser, fresher feel to it. If you need to remove any paint, you can always use a damp brush just to lift it out. I think I want to increase the brightness on the petals a bit, so I'm going to add in a bit of white acrylic ink. And using the dropper to paint with rather than a brush will give me some more irregular marks and stop me being too precise. I just love the way the edges are bleeding here. It creates a much nicer finish. In fact, I think I'm going to add more water here to get the ink to bleed a bit more. Bringing in some violet and cerulean now to paint the shadow on this one, and another touch of indigo ink to increase the depth. So I'm just going to continue to add in the other flowers now in the same way. Finally, I'm going to use a soluble black pen to bring in just a little bit of detail, but I want to make sure I keep them as sketchy marks, nothing too precise. It's a good idea to just do a little bit, then step back and look at it, see if you're liking what's happening. Remember, it's always easier to add more than have to remove marks that you don't like, so go cautiously. So that's about it for now. I hope you've enjoyed it and that you'll give a few of these ideas a try in your own sketchbook. Remember, this is just a guide, and if you feel you want to add more things or do things differently, that's fine.